that okay?
Right.
Right, I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about excavations which were carried out in 2011 on the Whitehorse Hill Kist site in Dartmoor. I'm going to divide it into two parts. The first part is going to be what we found, and then there's going to be a shorter section at the end trying to set it in its kind of more regional context. So, Whitehorse Kist is located on just about the highest part of Dartmoor. In fact, it's on the second highest peak, at about 604 metres above sea level. It's in the one of the remotest parts too, because it's actually within inside the Oakhampton firing range, and it's here. So it's only accessible to the public at certain times of the year. And the hill it's on is kind of broad and sort of a long hill with a summit at either end. The Kist is, in fact, the highest known early Bronze Age monument on the moor. It's one of about 1,000 kists, cairns and barrows which are distributed within the national park. The slide our image shows the hilltop. The hilltop's mostly covered in blanket peat, and then at the northern summit of the hill there's what's called the Hanging Stone cairn, which is a nicely built barrel cairn, which has got the observation hut located right next to it. And then at the southern end, occupying a very similar position, is the Whitehorse Hill Kist. Now, as I say, most of the hill is actually covered in blanket peat, but these flattened areas that you can see around the Kist here, this is caused by peat cutting. So our mound has been cut around by peat cutters, and this dark line here is the track that's been cut up by the peat cutters to get up there. It's not a watershed. So this is me standing on top of the Hanging Stone Hill cairn, which is about 700 metres to the north, looking back, and you can see what, to all intents and purposes, looks like a skylined barrow here. So that's the mound in which the Whitehorse Kist is set. However, as I said, there's been peat cutting undertaken across the hill, and it's not entirely clear how much of a mound there would have been in the Bronze Age when you sort of think about the peat that would have been still in situ then. So I can't say how prominent this site was in prehistory. It's one of the things we haven't been able to sort out with the environmental recording. That said, there are a number of natural hillocks across the top of within the blanket peat, across the top of the hill. And I do like to think that there was a slight swelling in the peat which attracted people to construct the Kist there in the first place. We didn't discover the site. It has been known about since the 1990s, and it was first, actually, there's a section drawn there and published in the Devon Proceedings for 2000 by Joe Turner. At that time, they recorded the site as being largely destroyed. On this photograph, you'll see this stone sticking out the bottom of the section. That was thought to be the base stone. And where you can see the sort of verdant greenery at the behind, that was thought to be the back wall. So it was thought to be a site that was more or less gone. So in fact, when English Heritage did some recording on the site back in 2005, they didn't actually examine the Kist at all because they didn't think there was anything to learn. What they did was some environmental recording of the peat mound section next to it, and they obtained a couple of radiocarbon dates, one from towards the bottom of the Kist, which came out in the Middle Neolithic, another one around the top of the Kist, level with the top of the Kist, which came out quite nicely in the early Bronze Age. And that was that. And the strategy which they adopted with the National Park at that point was to build a wall in front of the Kist to prevent any further erosion to the site. However, with global warming and we had a series of dry summers back in the mid-2000s and very cold winters, that caused the wall to start cracking and falling down. So they decided then to fund a programme of excavation, which we carried out in 2011. As part of that programme, we undertook, or Phil Newman undertook, a detailed topographical survey of the site. And you can see here the hashes coming round. This shows the approximate extent of the site, as would have been. Our green, dark green here shows the site as surviving, the peat mound as surviving in 2011. The tan colour is erosion, and our site is just about hanging on the western edge of the peat mound. So here we are at the end of our first day. What we did was we cut back the section through the mound. we revealed it's about 12 metres in diameter and about 1.5 metres high. But as I say, those edges are entirely artificial and created by peat cutting. Sean Taylor and myself, who were carrying out the excavation at this stage, we started recording it in the typical kind of archaeological way. So we started assigning context numbers to the site. And at that point we were joined by our environmentalist colleague who pointed out the error of our ways and said it's actually in fact entirely natural, and what you're recording is differential drying of peat within the peat. So ignore all the context numbers on this drawing, they're all rubbish apart from the ones to do with the kist itself. And we made a record and we found that it was quite a simple constructed feature. It's about 0.8 long by about 0.7 wide, 0.3 high. It's got a base stone around which side stones were placed to create a box, and then a large stone was dumped on top of it. The side stones, I've just got to flag these up because they were quite interesting in the fact that they deviate from what we normally find with kists generally in the southwest. Normally they go for the squarest pieces of stones they can get, so they can create a nice box or square or rectangular box shape. Here they've gone for these tapering pieces of stone. We think the reason why they did that was so they could get something which would bed down into the peat, because they had the tapering ends went straight down into the peat, so they were giving extra bite and stability. So when we cut back the section, we found that we weren't able to find the actual true shape of the site as constructed in the Bronze Age, because the pressure of being in the peat mine for so long had actually squished most of the side stones out of position. However, it's likely that it was in fact square or rectangular rather when it was first constructed. The other thing we've been trying to do at this stage was to work out whether the site had been set within a cut, i.e. a hole had been made into the peat and then lined with stones, or whether it had been a freestanding structure around which the mound had grown. I was firmly of the opinion, although we couldn't prove it at this stage, that it would have been impossible for this site to have remained as a freestanding structure for the length of time it would have taken the peat to grow around it. It would have collapsed beforehand. But we did have a nice piece of information from the soil micromorphological work that we had looking at the structure of the peat, and this revealed that there had in fact been disturbance down the sides of the kist, and that's indicative of there being a cut made into it. In fact, the soil micromorphological work is interesting from another point of view as well, because we are able to establish that the capstone had been left clear of the peat. And we know this because this dark layer here, you can see at the bottom, which looks peaty, but in actual fact is a soil which is generated over time. So that the stone has to be left standing clear of the peat long enough for that soil to at least to started growing on it. And then in fact the peat above that had been dumped onto it. That's not in natural peat growth, that's material that's been dumped on at some later point in time. Well, I say the mound is entirely natural, and this has meant that we've been able to do a lot of different kind of environmental analyses of the material within the mound. I'm just going to run through some of the major techniques that we've undertaken, analysis we've undertaken. The first was tephra analysis. Now tephra is volcanic layers, it's ash that's associated with eruption, and each time there's an eruption it creates another layer of tephra in the environmental record. And we got very excited about this at first because we had 9 different volcanic eruptions throughout the growth of the peat mound, and 2 of them were just either side of our kist. Unfortunately, only 3 of these volcanoes have been characterised so far. So we've got 2 at the bottom. These are known as Leg A and B, and they date to the Mesolithic period. And then we have another one which I think is on the Heclas, which happened in the very early Iron Age. So from the dating from tephra, all we can say is our kist was constructed between the end of the Mesolithic and the beginning of the Iron Age, which isn't terribly helpful for Bronze Age studies. However, tephra identification and characterisation is an ongoing process, so maybe one day we'll get very close resolution for the construction of the kist. Rather more successfully was the analysis which we had done on the pollen and testate amoebae. Testate amoebae are single-cell creatures which basically like living in wet environments. So you can chart how wet or dry an environment is by whether these guys are present or not. We also, and what this is showing is that the ground is getting increasingly dry through time and driest in the Bronze Age. And this matches up also with the pollen analysis which we had done as well from the mound, which is again showing wetland species early in the sequence, and then as you're getting towards the Bronze Age, it's becoming a more sort of grassland dominated environment. It's still got wet pools there, but there's certainly grasses up there. And from work we've had done, work that's been undertaken by others, I should say, on elsewhere on Dartmoor, we know that the slopes of the hills at this time were still quite heavily wooded. So this would have been quite an attractive grassland, particularly for communities who are moving animals up and about the moors at this time. And in fact, this ties in very nicely with another strand of environmental work, which has been the non-pollen polymorphs, or fungal spores. Now these grow on the dung of animals, and what we find is that about the time the kist is constructed, and just before, there is a massive increase in the amount of fungal spores that are present in the mound. So in other words, there's more animals coming onto the moor at around the time the kist is constructed. We don't know what the animals are. In my naivety, I thought at first there might be sort of certain types of spores might prefer different types of animals, but that's not actually the case. So we don't know if it's sheep. This is just because it's a Dartmoor hill farmer. We don't know if they're sheep or cattle that have been grazed up on the moor at this time. We do know that both sheep and cattle were being grazed on Dartmoor in the Middle Bronze Age, about 3 or 4 centuries later, because animal footprints have been found within the Dartmoor field systems. So back to the excavation. We then cut off the top of the mound and found that the capstone was still in situ. This stone behind is one of the side stones again that's been pushed out of position by being in the mound. We then lifted off the stone. Our site isn't just 5% left, it's actually 95% in situ. So this is the wall coming round here, sides of the kist. The white stone thought to be the base stone is in fact a side stone that's been pushed out of true. It's just another one of the side stones. And we've got a completely intact deposit inside the kist. This grey layer, I should say, that you can see, that's actually spalled off granite from the capstone. We still at this time decided to go along with our environmental sampling strategy for the site because of the 130 or so kists which have been excavated, somewhere around about 30 of them have produced flints but not a lot else. So we thought we'd get most information by maintaining an environmental sampling strategy, excavating the site in spits, and then hopefully recovering information which we could match up from what was going on outside the kist. But almost at once, one of the environmentalists pulled out what she thought was a very strange carbonised seed, which on inspection was in fact a shale disc bead. We then cleaned up where she'd been taking her spit, and we thought we'd found, initially we thought we'd found fur, what looked like fur, and what was obviously cremated bone. So we decided at this point that we weren't going to do any further excavation of this deposit in the field. We did look further within the mound and around the outer edge of the kist site, and that turned out to be a rewarding experience too, because what we found here there were hazel stakes. This one is in the back corner. It's been cut with a metal tool, and it's about 1/2 metre long. And at the other back corner, a stake that's still in situ, running down the side of the kist stone. And these have identical radiocarbon dates of 1875 to 1690 Cal BC. And I think that what's happening here, these stakes are being used to mark out the site prior to the site to the kist being constructed. There may well have been 2 more, but they would have been on the outer edge of the site and they'd have decayed a long, long time ago. So, as I say, we decided we weren't going to excavate this on site. What we actually did was we cut around the base stone, lifted it up, wrapped it up in cling film. Here it is in the barrow, and we'll have to take turns pushing that down, and we had about half a mile, pushing this back down the hill to where the Land Rover could get to it. But it was the right decision, because everything you're going to see from now on with regards to excavation was undertaken by Helen Williams at the Chippenham Conservation Centre in Wiltshire. And she excavated, I think, about 250 items in the lab under very detailed conditions. Now I'm going to give you the run through what we found inside the kist from bottom to top, so it's in the order that it went in the Bronze Age. So starting at the bottom, we had what was obviously plant material. We thought initially that we'd found some plant matting, and we got very excited about it. So we sent it off to Karen Cartwright at the BM to look at, and this is one of her SEM images. And but what she found was, in fact, that it's not matting at all. What it is unidirectional stems from purple moor grasses. Now, about 90% plus is one particular type of grass. It's grass that still grows up on the hill today. In fact, we know from the stage of its life cycle that this was picked in late summer. And we've had supporting evidence of that from the pollen work that we've had done in the kist as well, because we found traces of meadowsweet flower as well, and they'd have been flowering late summer, early autumn. The first of our artefacts lay directly upon this layer, and it was at first we couldn't make out what this was. You can see a kind of buff coloured area here, which looked like sort of plant material, and then we had what looked to be more kind of leathery looking material as well, but they seem to be joined together, and this is a completely unique artefact in the British Bronze Age. Here's it cleaned up and conserved, and what you can see is you've got this panel here. This is nettle fibre that's been stitched, and then onto this, attached this by these triangular shaped pieces of animal hide, which we now know belongs to a calf. The stitching medium hasn't survived at all, and that's because certain types of animal material, such as sinew, gut and skin, do not survive within the conditions of the kist. Here is a reconstructed segment of that item, which was done for an exhibition in Plymouth. Here is that nettle fibre here, and then the animal hide it's dark on this side because they were looking to see what difference dyeing would make to its appearance. We did actually have analysis undertaken for dyes, but they came back as being inconclusive. There's two lines of theory of what this might have been. It's possible that it may have been part of a garment, it may have been a kind of panel on a tunic, something like that, or a sash or belt. I tend to prefer that interpretation. I think it works better as some kind of sash or belt, and there are in fact parallels for similar types of artefact from slightly later in date Danish log coffins, where they're often associated with high status female burials. Now we have the first of our bundles. This one was a pelt which contained the cremation, and on top of this, holding it together, was our only copper alloy object from the site, with this pin here. This again has caused some excitement because Alison Sheridan, when she was looking at this, has identified this as being a twisted shank pin. There are hardly any of these in Britain. They're much more commonly found on the continent. There are 3 known from Wessex, and this example is one from Dorset. Again, this is going to be a kind of high status item of dress. Awls and pins are again frequently associated with female burials. Here is the pelt, which are on the slab prior to investigation. Here's the pelt after conservation. It looks very fluffy, and that's again because the skin has not been preserved at all, or hardly at all, so what you're left with is the fur. And we know it's from a large animal, about 56 centimetres by 39. It's from the hindquarters, so it's the highest quality bit of the pelt. We've had it radiocarbon dated 1740 to 1530 Cal BC. But the great problem we had with this was actually identifying what sort of animal that it was. Because the skin didn't survive, it meant that DNA couldn't be edited. We tried DNA, but that didn't work. And we had various different macro techniques tried on it, and we really weren't getting very far with finding out what it was for certain until luckily Carolyn Slutzio at the Smithsonian carried out proteometric analyses and identified it as bear, or bear family, I should say, to be more correct. Given that we're in temperate Europe, it's likely to have been a brown bear rather than a polar bear. We don't know whether it's a local inhabitant. I'd quite like to think of it as being a local inhabitant to Dartmoor or a traded item. Certainly bears are surviving in northern Britain into the Roman period, but I think the latest evidence from southern Britain is from a couple of sites in Wiltshire, and they're late Neolithic. So whether there was any remnant bear population in Dartmoor is open to question. Again, it's likely to have been a high status object. It may well have been used as a garment before it was used to wrap up the pelt. It's likely to have been highly symbolic. We know from ethnography and indeed from early European traditions about the connotations of wearing and implications of wearing bear skins. So it's likely to have been a highly symbolic piece. Now within the pelt was the cremation. We don't know the gender of the burial because it's too poorly preserved to make any identifications. We have been able to say that it's of a young person, 15 to 25. There's probably only about a third of it there. That is entirely in keeping with what we find in the southwest region. Whole burials of complete individuals are quite rare in our area. Far more common to get token or sometimes mixed cremations. Again, we've had this radiocarbon dated to 1930 to 1750 Cal BC. You'll notice on here there are some black. This is charcoal, and we've had that analysed as well, and we found out that it is uniformly oak, a mature oak that's been seasoned. It's therefore very unlikely that the cremation took place on Whitehorse Hill itself. It would have been an absolute mammoth undertaking to drag the amount of wood that you need to burn an individual to the top of the hill. So it's much more likely that it was done down in one of in the valleys, and there was no evidence for massive amounts of charcoal in the mound either. There was no grave goods burnt with the body. We do know there were some fragments of textile, so we know that she was wrapped up prior to burial in some kind of garment or a shroud. All there was this one piece of wood which may be shaped, and the jury is a bit out on that one actually as to whether it is or not. The second container was located next to the bundle, the cremation bundle, and it had been completely flattened when we found it. It's a basketry container. We've had a detached piece dated to 1870 to 1620 Cal BC. When we lifted it out, it became immediately apparent that it wasn't just a single piece of basketry, but it was actually a composite item that's been stitched together. You can see the stitching here on one end there. And here is the one of the ends in fact wasn't stitched all the way around. It was in fact left as a lid. Now the fibre for the basket, we've had that identified, and it's lime bast, which is an interesting choice of material. In order to turn it into basketry, you can only take the fibres from the tree, I think in June, when the sap's at the right level. Otherwise you can't get the fibres out. Then you have to soak it in water for six or 7 weeks, and that process is called retting. And at that point you can then start weaving it into basketry. So it's a lot more complex than, say, using willow or hazel materials like that. However, it does have one useful property, and that is that it's water resistant. And if you're a pastoralist sort of trampling across the moors in less than dry conditions, you might want to keep some of your things dry. So I think that may have made it a particularly good choice of material. The fibres around the hairs around the top, we've had these identified. and these are of cattle hair again. This is you can see the original in the background there. This is at the Plymouth Museum. In the foreground, this is the reconstructed item. It's quite interesting when they did they didn't have time to do the lid, but you can look around the top here where the cattle stitching is. It looks quite decorative, and I do wonder if this is actually, in fact, similar to decoration on pottery that we find on ceramic vessels at this period. They've tried to make it kind of a decorative feature. Again, this item is completely unique in a British context. The nearest types of things have been found in Irish bogs and with Danish log coffin burials, such as Boreham Esjov that we can see here, where small containers were found with a log coffin burial. These, I have to say, are somewhat later again than our burial. These tend to date to about 1500 to 1200 Cal BC or thereabouts. We knew right at the start that there were going to be objects inside the basket, because we could see some spilling out onto the kist slab, and in fact there are about 250 or so objects inside it. Prior to excavation, the basket got shipped off over to Mary Davis at the National Museum of Cardiff, who has some really great equipment, and she was able to do a series of x-rays, was able to pick out a large number of artifacts, so we were able to identify the shell beads. This blob here is a flint, and you can see one of our wooden studs, for example, in the top corner there. And that meant that Helen had to do very meticulous recording of the basket as she was excavating, and produce a series of very detailed drawings showing the location of all the different finds from within it. Here's the first one. This is what we've called the woven band or bracelet. Here are the x-rays which were taken of it. We had the x-rays done, which you can see here, these studs coming round. We had XRF undertaken on this object at this point, and this revealed that these studs were in fact of tin. And tin is as an unalloyed material, is very, very rare in the British early Bronze Age. It's almost always alloyed with copper to produce bronze. There are very few pure tin pieces. So this is completely unique as an object. This is it after conservation. You can see here the tin studs are less than prepossessing. We can be forgiven for not knowing what they were when we first saw them, I think, because they'd actually look more like bits of chalk more than anything else. And what really stands out on the original is the weaving that's gone, the braiding that's gone in here to which the studs are set into, and we've had this identified, and these again cattle hair. This is a reconstruction of the object, and actually at this point you can see that when on the reconstructed item, it's really the tin which really grabs your attention, and this really does actually stand out against the skin when it's worn. Instantly, when I said that it was cattle hair, it must have been from a type of cow, something like an Aberdeen Angus or something like that, with a long kind of forelock, in order to give enough length to actually make it either that, or Alison Sheridan's speculated it may be an Auroch, but we're not able to identify it that closely beyond cattle. Our next item is the wooden studs, and we had two pairs of wooden studs within the kist. Larger pair are thought to be ear studs, and the smaller pair, although they could be ear studs, are thought more likely to be the breadths, and that means that they've been pierced through some other parts of the body, like the lips or the cheeks. Interestingly, when we thought at first they'd turn out to be carved, but analysis has shown they're actually turned, and this has put turning back by about 500 years or so. It was thought to be a Middle Bronze Age innovation, but in actual fact these are turned. Radiocarbon dated to about 2200 to 1980 Cal BC. The wood is spindle wood, and that still grows on parts of Dartmoor today, so they're likely to have been fairly local. The next artefact is rather less exciting than some of the others that we've seen so far. But it's worth, it was found inside the bag. It's a simple flint flake that has had some use. It's damaged along the edge of it here. But it's worth remembering at this point, I think, that had our site been like every other kist that's been excavated on the moor, this would be the only artefact surviving to date from the site. So it's a salutary reminder of how much has been lost from the archaeological record. And also, we shouldn't quite overlook it, because the fact it's been included in the basket with all the other things must have meant it was a special object to somebody and thought worthwhile including with the others. Next item is the composite necklace. And this was made up of about 210 beads thereabouts. In order of magnitude, there was 1 of tin, there were 7 amber beads, 92 beads of Kimmerid shell, and about 110 of clay. The tin bead, we actually identified this one fairly early on because we had a portable XRF run over it, and this gave a very, very definite spike for tin. Again, this makes it unique in a British context. In fact, there was only one other tin bead known from a British early Bronze Age site. That was from Sutton Veny in Wiltshire. Copt Hall found rather different to this one. It was seems to be mimicking the shape of a fount bead, but unfortunately that's lost. So this now becomes the sole representative of the tin bead in Britain. There were hints there may have been a second one. You can see it's like a constellation of smaller pieces. Possible there was a second tin, but it must have been broken in antiquity, so it's a bit of a mystery as to what happened to that one, if it is indeed a second bead. Here it is after conservation. It's quite a simple object. It's a fold, very simply folded over piece of tin to make a cylindrical object. The question I get most frequently asked actually is, where did the tin come from? So I'll answer that one now. What we can say is that it's probably a southwest source. At the moment, the only analysis to identify sources of tin has been undertaken in West Cornwall. There's been no comparative work done in East Cornwall or on Devon. So all we can say is like to be broadly from the southwest region. Can be more specific about the amber beads. These will have come from the Baltic originally, although again Alison's work on the distribution of amber beads has pointed out this very large concentration in the Wessex area and around Stonehenge. It's much more likely that our people on Dartmoor obtained their amber from Wessex. But even that wouldn't have been a small undertaking, because this is 180 kilometres to the east of our site. As I say, there were 7 beads of amber, 4 of them these sort of donut-y shaped ones, and there's 3 cylindrical examples. And Alison's work has been very, very interesting on this. What she's found is, in fact, that it's very unlikely that our amber beads were made specifically for our necklace, because quite a few of them show evidence for wear. This one's got a break on it, for example, and there's damage around the ends of others. So it's likely that, in fact, these had already been part of another necklace and then included with ours. That doesn't mean to say that, however, they were sort of like cast-offs or anything like that. It's much more likely that they were, in fact, even more valued because they had biographies and perhaps were heirlooms which had been passed on to the owner of this necklace. The shell beads, there are 92 of these. These are much more uniform in size and shape than the amber beads. There was one larger one, a distinctly larger one. We think that was probably for the clasp. Again, these are likely to be obtained. These were obtained from Dorset, from the Kimmeridge area, 130 kilometres this time from the coast. These ones we thought at first were likely to be sort of cut off a tube because that would be the easiest way of making them. However, in actual fact, they seem to have been individually fashioned. The other interesting thing about them is that they show very few signs of wear. So, in fact, these ones are, in fact, likely to have been made for our necklace. And the most common form of bead that we had, which are over 110 of them, making up approximately half the necklace, are these clay beads. These are very simply made. They just had a stick pushed through them basically to make the hole, and just very simply rolled. These are granitic clay, so they're likely to have been derived from a source on Dartmoor. It's likely this is out of a stream on Dartmoor. Interestingly, there was very little in the way of articulation of the necklace surviving, but where we do have a suggestion of articulation, they seem to have been interspersed with the shale beads. So this means they may have been trying to bulk up the shale content, or the effect of the shale in the necklace a little bit. And this is a representative sample of the beads to give an idea of colour. We think there is a distinct colour gradation. This from dark at the ends through to lighter, and then the central tin bead. You get a much better idea of that from the reconstruction which was done for a BBC programme, where you had the dark beads. Then of course the amber would have been very much lighter in the early Bronze Age before it got stained by being in the peat for so long, and it would also been glowing as well, because amber has electrostatic properties. And then you'd have this very fine shiny tin bead in the middle. I'll say in the Bronze Age, when you would have had a far more muted range of colours for clothing, this really would have stood out as a piece. And then finally, there was a second layer of plant matting which was put on top of the items in the kist. Unfortunately, this time we cannot identify the plant species. So now I'll just give a bit of wider context for our find in terms of its kind of regional setting. Kists are of course widely found across the British Isles and Ireland, especially in upland areas. That said, Dartmoor has a particularly noticeable concentration of them. There are around about 200 of them, and that is far more, for example, than are found on Bodmin Moor, which is just a few kilometres to the west. They're simple structures. They're usually square or rectangular. The ones which don't get put in the barrows often are covered by a distinctive piece of granite, like our Whitehorse kist, but also this one here at Lake Head. And this would, of course, made them distinctive places in the landscape. But the Dartmoor ones stand out within that tradition markedly in terms of their orientation. For example, 95% of Dartmoor kists, or thereabouts, including the Whitehorse kist, are aligned northwest to southeast. And this was an observation that was made initially quite a long time ago by the Victorian antiquarian Baron Gould. And you may think that's just a general Bronze Age thing, but if you go to Bodmin Moor, a few kilometres to the west, you'll see that there is absolutely no pattern at all in orientation. So this does seem to have been a Dartmoor preference. A second Dartmoor preference that we picked up on is absence of evidence. These are some charts of finds from barrows and cairns in the southwest region, counties of Dorset, Somerset, Cornwall and Devon. Ignore the bottom two, they're not really important. What is important is this top line here. And this shows that around about half the barrows and cairns in Dorset, Somerset and Cornwall, in fact more in Cornwall, include pottery. When you go to Devon, an interesting thing happens, it's less than a quarter. And I became interested to see, well, actually most of the sites which have been excavated in Devon are actually found on Dartmoor. There was a huge campaign of excavating sites on Dartmoor in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Over 100 sites investigated. So this is having a big knock-on effect of how the rest of the county is perceived. So if you start looking at the barrow cemeteries when you get off Dartmoor in Devon, what you find out is that they're actually pretty much lining up with what we find in Cornwall and Somerset and Dorset. In fact, that ceramic assemblies start appearing. This is Elberton, which in fact is not far from Dartmoor, just by Plymouth to the south. And we have ceramic vessels dating to the same period as the Whitehorse kist. Upton Pine, if we're going to the north and east, we find nice ceramic assemblages appearing from the barrows there as well. And if I go to the Far Way, which is the other big barrow group in Devon, on the Dorset border, again we're getting ceramic vessels turning up. And in fact, on Dartmoor itself, in the beaker period, or beaker using period, we find that beakers are relatively commonly put into kists, and there are some very nice examples, some of the best examples from the county, including the Fernworthy beaker, which had this jet button found with it, were being placed in with burials. But once you get into the post-Beaker period, what you find is there is a marked drop-off, and only about 5% of excavated sites, and there's about 130 of them, have produced any pottery. So this implies that there's a deliberate choice by communities on Dartmoor not to include ceramics in their grave assemblages. Perhaps, in light of the Whitehorse kist, it is not evidence of lack of material culture, but more that they're likely to be carrying around basketry. And perhaps, if you're thinking about pastoralist communities moving their animals up to the moors, maybe they don't want to carry ceramic vessels up there, maybe they've got a basketry tradition instead, and it's just now entirely lost to us, with the exception of the Whitehorse kist. Another question I had was wondering how, in terms of richness or status, the Whitehorse kist fitted in with other sites in the region. Of course, the only way to do this was to exclude all the organic artefacts from the equation, because there's nothing comparable from any of the other sites. And what we're actually then left with are three artefacts, and that is the composite necklace, the flint flake, and the copper alloy pin. That said, even the copper alloy pin may not have survived on other Dartmoor sites. It may have just been a green smudge in another context on the moor. It is still, even if you bring it down to these 2 or 3 items, it is still richer than any other Dartmoor site bar one, and it is matching up with what we're finding elsewhere in the region for the period between about 1800 and 1600 Cow BC. So starting with that other Dartmoor site, this is the Hambledon Barrow. It doesn't have a radiocarbon date, but it has a very distinctive dagger in it, which is a Camerton Snows-Hill dagger with it had a very fine pommel of amber and gold studs. This is like to date to the period of the Whitehorse kist as well. Interestingly, this find is like to have been a secondary insertion into a much older site. The flint flake, as I said, is matched on other Dartmoor sites, kists. In fact, 26 other sites have produced flints, or nothing but flints. And they do tend to be scrapers and flakes rather than kind of arrowheads and that kind of thing. So, in fact, our flint flake is entirely in keeping with other finds from the moor. The pin is completely unparalleled in Dartmoor. There are no other copper alloy pins known from the moor whatsoever, and in fact there's only one other from Devon as a whole, and this is from Upton Pine. In Cornwall, likewise, there's an absence of pins to the west, but instead awls seem to be used in a comparable way, so they're taking the handles off awls and using them probably to tie up bundles and things. Beads, again, on Dartmoor, there's only 2 sites which have produced any. Morton Hampstead, cairn there, produced 6, but they've now been lost. And there was Shawmore Ring Cairn, excavated by Jeff Wainwright in the 1970s. Charcoal-filled pit had 7 faience beads, so nowhere near a complete necklace. And interesting to note, there was no burial found with these beads at all. And again, this is very similar to what we find in Cornwall, where there are no complete necklaces at all. Lowland Devon has turned up 2 sites, further sites with composite necklaces on it. This is this is North Moulton rather. This was found with a cremation and a kist in the 19th century. Unfortunately, the cremation was not retained, so we don't know the gender of the burial. This one's a bit different from ours in that it's got biconical beads and faience beads and just one amber bead, which has been reconstructed in the centre here. So it's rather different in form, although again there is this interplay of light and dark, which is slightly reminiscent of the Whitehorse necklace. But then we have this one from Upton Pine, which is, in terms of its structure, quite similar to ours, with these sort of disc beads coming down and this centrepiece with what may be a burnt amber bead in the middle. This one we radiocarbon dated recently as part of a project that we were doing, and it's come out as 1600 to 1420 Cow BC, which is a little later than what we're expecting actually. So it may be, and this has been a curated item that had been kept for some time prior to burial. As I said, Broadly speaking, however, the Whitehorse kist assemblage comes at a time when there is a marked increase in artefacts being placed in barrows in our region. So this period, broadly 1800 to 1600 Cow BC. We can see, for example, the Farway 24 barrow in East Devon produces one of the fine shell cup, and then on Bodmin Moor and in Cornwall to the west, we have another cup, this time gold, being put into a kist with beads and a rather nice Camerton Snowshield dagger. Probably the closest to our site is this one, the Upton Pine. We've already seen the necklace and the pin, but there was also a dagger as well and an accessory vessel. Again, accompanying a cremation said to be female, although when we had the recent analysis done, not enough bone was survived from the site to be certain of this identification. It does, however, seem to have been in a kist-like structure, and the way the finds were arranged implied they kind of been bundled together with the pin holding something together, holding a bag together at the top. However, we do need to be cautious about seeing all artefacts as grave goods, even during this period. Many of these new artefacts which have been placed within barrows at this time are actually not found with individuals. They may not have been regarded as being individual property. They may have been regarded as ceremonial or community property. An example here being Farway 32, where you have this rather nice dagger and again another shell cup, which were placed in the mound, at the top of the mound, well away from the burial deposit. It's also important to remember that there are large numbers of barrows being constructed this period across the region which contain absolutely no artefacts whatsoever. So just to briefly recap to wind up, what we now know is that the person is likely to be a female, that she was cremated between about 1900 to 1700 Cow BC. This is likely to have happened away from the hill, and this person was wrapped in a garment or shroud. We know the site was marked out before the burial happened, that it was marked with hazel rods, and it's likely to have been a low mound within a grazed area, and that the site was cut out, lined with stones, and the artefacts were carefully placed inside in bundles. And then a large stone was placed on top, which would have marked the site and landscape. It was left clear of the peat, so it would have become a known place in the landscape. And we can say that although kist, this is part of a much wider tradition, that it was following local traditions of practice. The orientation follows that of Dartmoor generally, and the absence of pottery is also something we find across the moor. It's also in keeping with what we're finding elsewhere in the southwest, in that from about 1800, grave goods or artefacts are entering barrows and cairns, much more numerous than they have been before. Although it's important to remember these were not always directly associated with an individual. This project's has been undertaken over the last 4 or 5 years, and as it's gone on, we've ended up involving more and more specialists, and they've all done a remarkable amount of very high quality work. I'm not going to name them all individually. I'll just mention Vanessa Straker at Historic England for her guidance of the project, and Jane Marsham for the National Park. I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me to speak, and if you can bear to hear any more about the site, the book's due out, I think, late summer. Thank you.